Okay, here comes a brain dump about autism that no one asked for, but it's for me, so watch if you want. Also, these are my notes, so I'm gonna be looking at them. Why am I Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer? I already put fucking, hold on. That's a little bit better. The allergies are strong with this one. Okay. So autism is not new. By any stretch of the imagination, it's not new. However, the modern day research has a pretty short timeline that goes back, honestly, just over 100 years. Kind of makes sense because psychology and the study of the human brain and human behavior isn't that old either. But there's indications that people have been autistic for basically as long as we've been human, because it's just being human. Anywho, the early research was juicy, to say the least. So there were two separate researchers who were essentially doing research on autism at the same time in different parts of the country and didn't know either one of each other existed, so they say. One was this guy, Leo Connor, and he was in the United States and he was doing research out of Johns Hopkins and was in Baltimore. The other guy, this guy named Hans Asperger, was in Vienna, unfortunately, during the time that Nazis were ruling that area. Anyway, both men, separate of one another, claiming they didn't know the other existed and was doing the same research, interesting, were studying individuals who had differences in social interaction and communication style. Hans Asperger had many individuals that he studied, like over 200, and he had both men and women, and he had children and adults. So he was particularly interested in individuals who were kind of this higher level of functioning that we now kind of, well, previously knew to be Asperger's. So in researching all these individuals, he saw a wide spectrum of abilities and presentation of socialization differences. Due to the context of the time and the fact that he was also someone who identified these traits within himself, he presented his research only on the highest end, or the highest functioning individuals, to demonstrate their value and thus rationale for being saved during a time that was rampant with eugenics and massacre of feeble-minded individuals. So even though he knew there was a much broader spectrum of abilities and disabilities and that it affected both men and women, children and adults, he focused on these high-functioning boys. And that's who he presented in his research. Now, because his research was done in Vienna during World War II, this research didn't get transcribed or even really looked at in the United States till several decades later. Meanwhile, in the United States, we had Leo Connor, who was studying primarily, I think, but only children, and he was working with individuals who had very significant and severe disorders, and he had a pretty significant inclusion criteria of who he would study. When doing so, he presented this image that autism, or early infantile autism, I think he called it, was rare, severe, and only occurred in childhood. He also sort of implied that it was the parents' fault they had it, which then spawned this whole refrigerator mother chaos for decades to come. Later said that's not what he intended to communicate, and that he didn't ever say it was the parents' fault, but yeah. Prior to Leo Connor introducing this idea of child infantile autism, previously individuals who experienced signs of being autistic were just diagnosed as being schizophrenic. So Leo Connor's research was a step in the right direction, but it funneled response and research in kind of this really narrow and wrong direction for a while. Because Connor implied that the parents and their cold demeanor towards their children, or the refrigerator mothers, the cold mothers, were to blame for autistic traits, parents, full of shame, were trying to figure out cures and alternative reasons that it could have possibly been other than them. So lots of money was funneled into research trying to find a biological reason for autism and thus a cure. Because of the shame around it and this notion that it was a severe and childhood-only condition, a lot of adults, a lot of people kind of missed this possible diagnosis or this identity through, gosh, the 1950s through the, really, today, but especially until 2013. So it wasn't until like the 80s that we went back and started looking at some of Asperger's original research and saw that, oh wow, there is quite a variation. And there is this niche of individuals who do not have an intellectual disability, yet still have some of these characteristics of social or communication differences. And so they started adding additional diagnoses to the DSM, things like Asperger's syndrome. They introduced pervasive developmental disability and many variations thereof. So now there was not just one condition, but many. It wasn't until 2013 that all of these different siloed conditions were combined into one spectrum disorder, autism spectrum disorder. So your Asperger's syndrome, your Rett syndrome, your pervasive developmental disorders all kind of were lumped together into this one spectrum. And for the first time, from a diagnostic perspective, and thus culturally, we were seeing the true variation and diversity that exists within neurological functioning. But the story does not end here. In fact, the story is just getting started.